My nose working. All right, everybody, welcome to the Middle Ground, Mike. We got a great guest today, Z Wang. I really appreciate you coming on. It's China, like I was telling you before, has been something that has been a big focus. I won't say a focus of mine, but focus of trade policy, especially here in I call it the Rust Belt states. And we've been impacted pretty hard here by it. But it's a national thing in America too. It's not just the Rust Belt states. We just seem to notice it more, I guess. I really appreciate you coming on the show. Introduce yourself to everybody.
Sure, Joe. Real pleasure. Thank you so much for your time. My name is Z. I was born in Shanghai, China. Came to the States when I was 10. My father was one of the first generations of students to come and study in the U.S. After 1978. And I grew up in Los Angeles, went to Stanford for my college, and then I worked at Intel. I was a managing director at Intel, represented the company negotiating with the Chinese government on intellectual property and 4G technologies. Intel was nice enough to send me to Harvard for my MBA. After that, I spent a year as a White House fellow under President Obama. And then I started a company, a financial services data company in Shanghai. So I was an entrepreneur in China, kind of went through that experience. And then I moved back to the States and I was president of a nonprofit called Midi 100. This was founded about 30 plus years ago by prominent Chinese Americans like I.M. Pei, Yo-Yo Ma, kind of an organization of the most prominent Chinese Americans in America, focused on Chinese American inclusion in America and a more productive U.S.-China relationship. And then I was there for almost 4 years, and then I stepped down and I have a fund now investing in education in America. Now, this book, Rethinking China, kind of came on because in those 4 years, I was really at the intersection of civil liberties and national security. If you remember, during COVID, there was this huge increase in anti-Asian hate and violence. And unfortunately, the only people who look Chinese in America are the Chinese, the 5 million of us who are Chinese Americans. So we were squarely caught in the middle between national security and civil liberties. And our goal was to make sure that we advance the national security priorities of America while protecting the civil liberties that we all hold dear as American citizens. And so I worked with the White House, the State Department, the FBI, the Department of Justice, Congress in both houses, and state and local governments. And I realized for the first time that so many of the assumptions that drove our courses of actions for the last decade are not only misleading, but many of them are patently wrong. And so I spent about 2 years after that speaking to probably 300 of the most prominent experts in this country, people from Harvard, Yale, Stanford, all the think tanks, and former ambassadors to China, etc. And this is kind of the product of this book, right? Because here's 2 key points I want to start by saying. First, the book is not about whether China is a threat or not. The book is about what kind of threat is China. Because, the analogy with hurricanes are, if it's a category 5 hurricane, you better get into your car and get out of Dodge, right?
Right.
And if it's category 1, then maybe we close our doors and lock our windows. So depending on the category and the level of threat, we respond accordingly. But today, there's such a hysteria over China that our measures are unfortunately disproportionate. And so that it ends up hurting our competitiveness, our values, and our safety. Because this is a question I've asked so many Americans. The pivot from engagement with China to more competition and confrontation started about 9+ years ago. So we now have a decade of results. And I've asked this question over and over again. After about a decade of a fundamental shift between our relationship with China, are we more secure? Are we more economically more competitive? And our values enhanced because of those policies? Or are we less? Because everyone I've spoken to, and I'm sure you will agree, is in fact, we are less secure. Our values are more diminished, and we seem to be less competitive vis-a-vis the Chinese. So look, I think intentions are important, right? And I believe that our political leaders operated with good intentions, but good intentions don't equal good results. And the road to ruin has been paved with good intentions. So now after a decade, my focus is let's have a results-focused analysis, right? Based on all the data and evidence of what has the policies that have been undertaken by not just the Republican administration, but also Democratic administration. What have they yielded us? And if they have not helped us, if the results are not there, then what can we do in terms of understanding our assumptions better and then have courses of actions that actually better protect us and make us more competitive. So that's kind of the premise of the book, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, we kind of talk about that, right? So, a little bit of a precursor before per se I asked the question. So, I grew up per se a libertarian, which at 13 years old, that's kind of like what? This was in the 90s. So, but then, I kind of was like, okay, well, libertarianism is a great idea, but it relies on everybody being good and honest, and that's just not life. And but like I kind of really started looking back at the robber barons of the United States, right? The guys who really made America, like they put us on the map, right? The big industrial tycoons really built the country in that aspect. But what they always seem to do, because, what I think a lot of people forget is cheap labor's always been there. And a lot of people forget about the Chinese to help build the railroads in America. That's just something that they don't talk about here. But capitalism in America was always supposed to be okay, you got somebody that's more competitive than you. Even though I may not have as many people in the factory, I'm going to figure out a way to produce even more faster. So it doesn't matter what you're paying people. And I feel like that's where the United States got away from. And I feel like that's, not just the approach from our government, but I feel like the approach from the business leaders, not focusing on that aspect of capitalism is really, at least to a degree, really hurt them, really hurt the United States. Because look at Henry Ford, right? I want to make a car that's affordable, but and then on top of it, he paid more money, but he made it so people could afford it. That mentality. And I've kind of joked about it. I say sometimes I feel like in the United States, we're in cannibal capitalism. We're cannibalizing ourselves, where sometimes certain companies will be like, well, I can, and I get it, like I understand how business works. I'm in business, right? But, it's the robber barons seem to where they wouldn't have, if it was like $100 million, they may have went to the government and say, hey, we got to figure out a way to make this happen. Whereas now there just doesn't seem to be among corporate America that loyalty to build your country up anymore. Whereas, like Henry Ford, despite all of his faults and things like that, was, hey, I'm about America for the most part, right? JD Rockefeller, even though Carnegie was, I believe, Irish, he wanted to build America up where now those leaders don't. And I feel like that really hurts our trade policy with China because how can you be competitive if your corporate leaders don't think in the mindset of being competitive with China? So I mean, just from your perspective, right? Like, is that something that is like a reality or is it just like a pie in the sky thought?
Yeah. So this is great because I want to deep dive a little bit into this, right? In this book, I kind of focus on two key assumptions. First, around intellectual property theft. The second around economics, which you're talking about, and then the next is on human rights, and then the fourth is on national security. Because these are the four areas that seems like we're heading on a collision course, right? And first of all, I want to be very clear that we are today at war with China. We're in a tech war, we're in a currency war, we're in a media war, and through Ukraine, we're in a proxy war. The only war we're not in right now is a kinetic war, an armed conflict between the two largest economies in the world, both of which have nuclear weapons. The only war that we're not in right now, and we're dangerously close to it. And I want to make sure that as an American, just like you, that if we actually venture down to a war with another nuclear superpower, we better know what's going on. We better get our assumptions right. We better get our facts right because that could be catastrophic. The last couple of decades, we've been in a lot of wars, but no one we actually warred against had an ability to threaten us and threaten the mainland. But this one's different. So we better get our assumptions right. And more importantly, for me, we went into Iraq based on the false assumption that there were weapons of mass destruction. There wasn't. We went into Afghanistan based on the assumption that in order to defeat Al Qaeda, we have to defeat Taliban. That wasn't true. Right? So we better get our assumptions right. So let's deep dive a little bit into the economic assumptions. Economically, we've heard these. The Chinese are stealing jobs from us, especially manufacturing jobs. And the number has been 4 million. Now, 4 million is the number that of all manufacturing jobs that were lost in a 10-year period. Look, economists could debate how much of that is actually attributed to China, but let's say all of it is attributed to China. Now, I've talked to, and this is commonly called the China shock, right? I've talked to the authors of the China shock paper, both from Harvard, MIT, and I talked to a lot of economists that have looked at the shock that China brought. Let's assume it is correct that 4 million manufacturing jobs were lost, many of them in middle America, in places like, you grew up in, right?
Yeah.
However, that's actually only half of the story. The other half is all these authors also found that an equal, if not more, jobs were created because of China. And so what are these jobs? Usually they're on the coast And usually they're focused on more high tech and more advanced industries. The perfect example is Apple. So Apple outsourced all their manufacturing to Foxconn, based in China. Yet they hired a huge number of designers, marketers, engineers, mostly in California and in other coastal cities. So the first insight that across the board these authors have told me is it's not just the fact that China took the manufacturing jobs. It's that when the benefits of the globalization that came because of the detriments, it was very unevenly distributed. And so regions where people were less educated, less mobile, were hit the most. And we did not have a policy from the government down to the state, federal, to the state, local level. We did not have a policy to help these folks so that they actually benefited from this massive shift in globalization. Because look, unless today we say we want no global trade, even if we took out China, Apple's still looking at India. If we took out India, they're looking at Mexico. You take out Mexico, they're looking at Vietnam, right? That's the important thing to realize that these companies are looking at alternatives even if we take out China. It's not just a China problem. China was the harbinger to tell us that we have to address this domestic issue, that the benefits are not evenly distributed. We got to help the Americans who are worst hit. So the second point of, and you mentioned this, is who are benefiting the most? It's actually the corporations. And this actually goes directly into this trade imbalance, right? Because we hear US and China has this huge trade imbalance, which is true, but only partially. So the overall trade, now it's getting a little jumbled now because there are all these third countries, transshipping, etc.
Yeah.
But about just 2, 3 years ago, it's about a $1.2 trillion relationship. So $600 billion of export imports, but also $600 billion, most of which are American companies making money in China, like the Starbucks, the McDonald's that opened up in China. Except all of that profits have not flown back to the United States. Right now, President Trump, got to give him credit where credit is due, had attempted to entice some of these American companies to move the profits back. And so one thing we have to realize is if we put American companies as part of the American ecosystem, are making a lot of money off China. It's just that the money is not brought back and well distributed to the people who are hurt the most. So those are two things I think are very important, because if we take out China, or if we destroy China, unless we don't outsource anything, which American companies will fight tooth and nail to ensure, we still face the two issues of uneven distribution of benefits and drawbacks in America, and American companies not taking their profits back. So those are the two things that we really need to focus on if we really want Americans to benefit.
Right. Yeah. And that's kind of what what the robber barons did to a point. As America grew, and especially here in Detroit, as Detroit grew, we used to supply 25% of all goods made in the world, right? And back then, and I don't know, obviously I was not alive, but those companies seem to be a little bit more willing to take that money and put it back into their communities because they realize the benefit of it. Whereas now, to me, and this is where I read somewhere, and I can't remember where, that one of the biggest problems in the United States is a lot of the profit doesn't come from startups like it did 100 years ago. So a lot of the people leading corporate America in a lot of situations didn't per se start out at the bottom. So they don't have that same symbiotic relationship with the working class that some of them did back then. So that affects the way that they think, right? And like you were saying, a lot of people see a lot of, I don't want to say bad things behind a lot of policies, right? They'll be like, oh, there's this evil. And I'm like, I don't think the world's as evil as people think. I think some things just get thought about a certain way and then
Yeah.
people just go with it. And that kind of leads to other problems.
Yeah.
And sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, Joe, you're right on point, because when I was at Harvard Business School, we read um, company reports from 100 years ago. And back then, when these company leaders talked about profit, they included the community as
Yeah.
part of the profit generation. But today, and this probably largely happened in the 70s to 80s, the entire purpose of most public corporations, if not also private corporations, is to maximize value to shareholders. And shareholders are a different breed, right?
Oh, yeah.
Shareholders are all about my share prices and what kind of distribution you can give me, right? So when your incentives are aligned differently, then of course companies are going to do, different things. And if your incentive is less about the community, less about the people that work and live there, and more about shareholders that could be anywhere drawing a profit, then of course we're going to see the effects.
Yeah, and I did gosh, I can't remember. I've done 144 episodes since May. So some of them kind of get jumbled together in my head. I did one where I talked about the 17th Amendment of the United States. It made the US Senate popularly elected, across the state rather than appointed by the states. And here that leads into the trade policy. Washington has become more disconnected from America. As the years go on, they're more and more disconnected from us, just like the founding fathers said would happen. They said that's exactly what's going to happen if you don't watch it. And where that comes in is now you don't really have a representative of the state in the federal government. It's a populace that's been elected, and the populace takes campaign donations. Before that, a lot of people were appointed by state legislatures. And to me, where that makes a big difference, okay, like you were talking, like the policy, right? Okay, a senator from Michigan is going to have a lot more of an idea what's going on the ground floor here if he's appointed by the legislature, he or she. So when he goes to Washington, he can say, hey, this is actually what's happening. And he's not doing the talking points of whichever group, gave him that push. And the reason they did it back then was there was a lot of fraud, selling per se the seats, but it's a lot harder to do that now. It's a lot, so I think that part of the problem in the United States is their states are not represented in the federal government. So, the states are beholden to the whim of who's ever president. That's the way the wind blows, because I think a lot of issues in the United States that, you see on TV at the national level for trade, labor, are the same we face down here at the local level. So if
Yeah.
the local was actually legitimately represented, I don't think we would be in this situation because China has the same problems we do, right? They just look different. You were talking about human rights, and I actually talked about this in another episode. And I'm forgetting the name. The Muslims that are in China that get put in
Yeah. The
internment.
Uyghurs. Yeah.
That's the names. And I tell people, when they come out and they're like human rights in the United States and low labor, I'm like, where's your concern about that? That is a bigger threat and to them than like what's going on there in the aspect that anything we got going on here, humans right. But you
Yeah.
never ever hear about it. And to me, why you don't hear about it is because if the United States poked that bear, that would be a very big problem for us, and that's kind of, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? Because I've never really had a chance to ask anybody with a lot of knowledge
Yeah.
behind that.
Yep. Great question. So I just want to tie up the last point you made, which is, the amount of time I spent in DC, I realized it is really, I like to assume that, and I think the vast majority of political leaders I met across both parties do genuinely want to do some good. But in DC, it's so easy to get into groupthink, meaning you just repeat the same rhetoric and the rhetoric seems to become reality. And because you're in such a nice little bubble, divorced from what's going on, in Michigan or in Iowa and elsewhere, you just live in the rhetoric. And this is why, this book, Rethinking China, I'm really focusing on results. All right, it's been 10 years. What are the results, right? And does the results tell the story? Does the results match the rhetoric? Because if it doesn't, the rhetoric is wrong. The results are not wrong. The rhetoric is wrong, right? So I think that's very important and this is why, I very much enjoy conversations like this, Joe, because you seem to be an independent thinker.
Yeah.
You seem to try to correlate what you've been told by the media, by the political class with what's happening on the ground, which is what's happening. What are the results on the ground, right? So that's the first point, and I appreciate that. To human rights, I'll tell you, when I first got into this, I wasn't a human rights expert, but I spent a lot of time with real human rights experts, Human Rights Watch, United Nations experts from Colombia, etc. And I've realized two fundamentally things, right? One is we have American values. We're Americans. We have American values. I was talking to a German just a few hours ago. They have their German values, right? I'm sure the French have their French values. For us to speak up on human rights, it can't just be because we do it this way in America, right? There's got to be something more universal. So the first thing I had to ask is, well, what's universal? What's everything that everyone around the world can ascribe to? Well, in I think 1952, thanks to Theodore Roosevelt in San Francisco, we actually passed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which all members of the UN subscribe to, including China, including North Korea, including Iran, right? Including all these countries. They all subscribe to this, right? And so I think the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that's the basis by which we should call out China, any country, right, that does not abide by something that they've signed up to. Now, unfortunately, today, we haven't really figured out how to deal with these international systems that we created, we helped create it. And today, we're in a situation where perhaps we want it, but we're also in many ways undermining it. And so that's one of my biggest concerns because we should be, the beacon on the hill. We should be a standard bearer for human rights, and we should speak up on human rights whenever it is not in accordance with these universal principles. But today, I'm not quite sure if we have done our part to actually uphold those systems that underpins those human rights. And then the second thing that after talking to all these experts, I realized is sanctions just don't work. I mean, anecdotally, we've been sanctioning North Korea for how long? They're still making nuclear weapons. We've been sanctioning Iran for how long? We've been sanctioning Russia for how long, right? Sanctions just simply don't work. And to your point, we've sanctioned China on Hong Kong. We sanctioned China on Tibet, and we sanctioned China on the Uyghurs, who are the Muslims that live in the Xinjiang area, but other parts of China as well. But they don't work. When it comes to human rights, I think we need to really assess our assumptions, which is good intentions doesn't equal good results. If what we've done so far haven't gotten us the good results, what should we do differently to actually get the results on the ground for those people who are quote unquote being abused in many different ways? And then the second is, are we willing to actually create a system, whether it be the system that we had before, whether it be a system that we reimagined? Because there's no international system that's viable without the leadership of the United States. I truly believe in this. And today, we don't seem to really want to do that. But at some point, we need to sit down and say, hey, if we are still going to speak about human rights, we got to have a system that everybody agrees to, and we're going to be the leader in that. So those are two things that I really realized. And without those, whatever we do, we're just not going to get the results we want.
And that's 1,000%. I mean, sometimes people forget here in the United States a lot of the. I want to not necessarily because obviously the atrocities happening elsewhere are a lot worse than what we've had here in a long time, but for how we look at things internally, we've had a lot, especially during World War II, and we whitewash it. Okay, and what like everybody always hears about the Japanese who were put in the camps in the United States, but what they don't talk about is like Mayans, like Germans, Italians, they were put into those camps too. And but what that goes back to is fear, right? Like, are you a spy? And then and people forget that in the United States that we haven't really had a war like that in so long. We've forgotten what it's like. We've forgotten
Yep.
what that fear is like, and that really what happened during COVID in that aspect, that fear was the same exact type of fear that happened during World War II.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I mean, but to be fair, not per se like about the fear, right? Is I didn't think President Trump approached where it came from the correct way. There was a lot of linkage to where it came from, a lot of circumstantial, right? No concrete proof. But I've always heard the phrase where there's smoke, it's probably fire. And rather than going, hey, China, we got to figure out what happened here. Let's work on this together. It was you did it. You're trying to hurt us. And here's the thing. Do I think the Chinese government was wanting to kill millions of people around the world I don't know them. I don't know. But, it just doesn't seem like it seems like they got bigger problems to worry about than, releasing COVID-19. But then, you got the Anthony Fauci situation, and he's heavily invested in the lab where it potentially came from. And then and this is where a lot of people get their frustrations with the US China situation. When President Trump was elected this last time, I think it was maybe not even 4 or 5 days later, the CIA comes out and says, oh, yeah, by the way, we're kind of sure that it came from that lab in China. And it's like, so then people think, well, you were in cahoots. Rather than everybody just coming out going, hey, man, it was a bad accident. Nobody was trying to kill anybody. Because I think that's more of what it was. I don't think there was a sinister intent behind it because, I mean, we've seen it. I mean, Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island in the United States, honest accident, and things just went haywire, and I think that is where like the fact that our government isn't completely upfront with us. Like, now, here's my thing is if President Trump wasn't elected, would that have even came out?
Yeah. Look, I think this is something I hear so much in DC, which is we know something, but it's classified.
Mhm.
Right. And my take is we should be as transparent as possible with the American people. That's just what we should do. And trust that the American people, when provided the data and the evidence, they'll make their own informed decisions. Right. Otherwise, it's so easy to operate on fear.
Yes.
And yet, you know this in our personal experience, whenever we do something based on fear, usually that's not the best decision for the long term. Usually, that's just not. And I'll give you a clear example of this because it affects our community very dearly. Is there's been a there's been persistent talk about IP theft from China,
Yeah.
and the number that's been used from 10 years ago is $600 billion. Now I'm an engineer by training, so the first thing I asked was, all right, how do you get the $600 billion? So I asked around government officials, etc. Finally, I got to the bottom of it. So it's basically an approximation started by the OECD. They basically said IP loss, which is not IP theft, IP loss, which is a bigger category, is usually 2 to 3% of a country's GDP. And the US being $20 trillion, 3% of $20 trillion is 600 billion. So whoever it might be in the government decided to attribute all of that to China, even though IP loss, the majority of that is considered counterfeit goods like stolen Nikes, etc. But let's focus on IP theft, which is, most people understand it as advanced technology, right? That makes a difference in people's lives. All the estimates I've seen from credible organizations, it's maybe about 30 to $40 billion. First of all, I started a business in China. I had a Chinese competitor who tried to steal our IP. So I understand even a dollar lost in IP is bad, is intolerable. But $30 billion is very different from $600 billion. Namely, it's 96% different because this goes back to my first point about what threat level, because depending on the threat level, we act accordingly. And let me tell you, because we believe that it was a $600 billion issue, what did we do? So the Justice Department launched this initiative called the China Initiative. And because, as I said to you, the only people who look Chinese are Chinese Americans, it squarely targeted the Chinese American scientific community here. Thousands of people were investigated, hundreds of cases were brought to trial. And I'm telling you, after all that, there were zero cases that were the government was able to pin anybody on economic espionage. The only couple cases they convicted people on were on wire fraud, meaning somebody had lectured at a Chinese university, took some money, but did not pay taxes. After thousands of investigations, hundreds of cases, zero economic espionage case. But you know what happened? Thousands of Chinese American scientists left and went back to China. Thousands of them decided not to work with the federal government anymore. Now you ask, so, in order to protect our national security, so what? A few thousand of them left. Well, here's the deal, Joe. The Chinese are 5 times our population. The only way we compete against the Chinese and against anybody in the world is by attracting the world's best talent, right? When I first started Intel, we had the legendary CEO, Andy Grove, and he said something I always remember, which is, he said, my core asset comes in at 9 a.m. and leaves at 5 p.m. Today, any IP gets outdated in like 12 to 16 months, right? Look at our phones. Gets upgraded every 18 months. Right? Only thing that's valuable for any country is the brain power. And the United States is able to compete because we attract people like Elon Musk, who didn't start Tesla in South Africa, came here, or the Google boys, right? Or, the founder of Zoom, Eric Yuan, right? They all started here because this is the place to be. And when we cut ourselves from the world's best talent, including from China, this is where we hurt ourselves. One statistics that's been now kind of more well promoted is 1/3 of the world's researchers, AI researchers, are Chinese. Most of them are here in the United States. So when we drive out key talents, we're really hurting ourselves. This is kind of a perfect example of how when kind of hysteria and paranoia takes over, we end up hurting our own. We're just hurting our own interests.
Yeah, and I think the United States really needs to get back to kind of like a tinkerer mindset. Because the United States up in, until what, 70s, 80s didn't really have a huge college like it wasn't like as big of a thing as it is in a lot of other nations, right? But where America was strong at is attracting the talent, but also that guy in his garage figuring out how he's gonna make it. And now there's so many rules and regulations. If you do that in your garage, you might go to prison, and depending on which government official's having a bad day. And I think that that's a big hurt for us because those are the guys that built America. The guy that was in his garage somehow had some random business guy that heard about what he was doing, strolled in, invested in it, and then, I mean, Apple, Microsoft, case in point. Nobody thought that those industries would be what they were at that time, but they seen it tinkering around in their garage and people said, that's a really good idea. But we're going against that now because now to me, sometimes if it's not somebody that's at the tippy top, nobody takes them seriously. It's like you can only be taken seriously if you're a multi-billionaire. And it's like JD Rockefeller was dirt poor. Henry Ford didn't grow up with a silver spoon in his mouth. Neither did Thomas Edison. These guys, JP Morgan did. I mean, he was he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, but that's how these guys do it. And I don't know about China per se in that aspect, but that's what made America so strong because we had that ability. You had the
Yep.
ability of a guy who had no idea about physics, no idea
Yep.
about computer engineering to figure it out on his own. And then things would just take off.
Yeah, Joe, I think this is what we always have to remember is what made America great again, great in the first place. That recipe still works today, right?
Yeah.
We just got to remember what that recipe is and get back to that recipe. I still think America is the best place for innovation. I still think America is the best place for the world's best talents. I still think when the smartest people around the world think, where can I start that amazing company? This is America, right? I still think that a child in America today still has a chance to, like you said, create something incredible, even in his or her backyard, even in his or her garage. I think that's still possible because that's the recipe that made us successful. I'm just saying we cannot get away from that recipe. And I think the only time we're going to fail is when we get away from what made us successful,
Yeah.
from the recipe that made us successful.
Yeah, and to me, in terms of competing with China, right? That's our biggest asset. And I don't know, because I know China's kind of like a hybrid of
Mhm.
communism, capitalism. It's
Yeah.
a really it's a complicated situation, and
Yeah.
we're in America, like we have that ability to, I don't know if the average Chinese person has that ability to do what we're able to do here.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I also want to add one more thing. I think another part of the recipe is America has never been shy about taking ideas from other countries and making it uniquely our own. Look at the Italian pizza. We made it 10 times probably more popular and successful. Look at the hamburger from Germany, right? Speaking of a hamburger, I've been to Hamburg, where hamburger came, and America took it and made it 10 times more popular, right? If there's a national cuisine in America, and judging by the number of stores, it's probably Chinese food. There's more than 50,000 Chinese restaurants in America, right? So what I'm trying to say is America is also successful not only because we allow people to tinker and fail and succeed, not only because we attract the world's best talents, but we also take the best ideas from around the world and make it our own. I'll give you another example. You probably remember in the 80s, there was a lot of fear about Japan taking over,
Yes.
right? So a lot of Americans, the American companies, instead of just getting fearful, they started saying, what can we learn from the Japanese? Well, they have this, better Six Sigma production system. Let's take it over. Let's put it into our Ford plants. Let's put it into our GM plants, right? Let's take what the Japanese could do well and make it American. And I think today we're kind of not doing that anymore. So there's this idea that the Chinese, all they do is copy and steal. Now, granted, like I said, they probably do. And in my book, I talk about documented cases where the Chinese have tried to steal our technology. And we need to do everything we can. And when I was at the Committee of 100, we worked with the FBI, particularly to actually devise kind of community aligned strategies to protect those national security. But on the other hand, the Chinese are becoming real innovators. You cannot doubt the fact that they are now world leading in electrical vehicles. You cannot doubt the fact that they're world leading now in renewables. You cannot doubt the fact that they're world leading in high speed rail, et cetera, et cetera. So we also have to go back to that recipe that made us successful and say, you know what? It's okay. If they got something good, let's take theirs and make it even better. That's, I think, what makes us a successful. And I think today, what I'm concerned is the assumption is, the Chinese, all they do is steal. They can't innovate on their own. And because we had that assumption for the last 10 years, they have been able to leapfrog us. I'll give you another example. About 10 years ago, the Chinese pushed out this policy called Made in China 2025. Started 10 years ago. And the US government got wind of it. I was, there, and the US government tried everything to try to put a hold on that, to try to stop it. Everything. And now 10 years passed. This year is 2025. so we can actually look at the results. Have we been successful in stopping China's progress in these 10 key
Nope.
sectors? Yeah, exactly. So the US Chamber of Commerce, an American organization, did a thorough analysis and found that in those 10 areas where 10 years ago, the Chinese were not world leaders, that's why they had the plan, right? And 10 years ago, probably the US were the world leaders in pretty much all sectors. In 4 of them, the Chinese have already overtaken the US and become the world leader. Again, I've already mentioned, high-speed rail, renewables, electrical vehicle, advanced materials like rare earth, etc. Right? And in another 3 or 4, they're almost caught up to us. So we got to really understand that these guys are real competitors, right? They innovate and they work hard, and the only way we can compete against them is also to innovate, out innovate them, out compete them, right? And do what we do best. Because there are certain things that we do, like you said, they can't match because of their system, because of how, that cultural norm is. There's certain things we can do that they cannot do. And we got to double down on what makes us successful. Because the last 10 years, focusing just on trying to keep them down hasn't given us the results. And we've kind of taken the eyes off the prize, which is how do we create that distance? How do we keep going so fast that there's no way that they can catch up to us, right? Because in those areas like high-speed rail, you can't say that all they did was just copy us and then stole the technology to be better than us, right? Same thing with EV, etc., right? These guys really innovated. So we really need to make sure that we don't take our eyes off the ball. And what I'm really concerned is even today, DC's more focused on them versus focusing on us. And I believe the only way we get better is by focusing on us,
Yes.
focusing on America.
I love that you brought up EVs. It's something that I've kind of, and I've been working on this episode for probably about 3, 4 months
Yeah.
because I don't want to say passionate about, but I'm one of those people to where if I hear something, I just start learning and learning and learning and
Yep.
just, I'll be up till 3 o'clock in the morning. Like, what's that? Hydrogen powered vehicles. And this is where I think that we have an edge over China. We have more natural gas. We have more ability to make hydrogen based products, which would give us the edge in terms of being able to produce cheaper energy. Electric cars are great, but they're great in inner city markets, metro markets. But to me, and I have not seen anything of any significance that would change it yet. They're like in Michigan when it's cold out, people with electric cars, man, their battery power goes down.
Yep.
Whereas if and I know that, hydrogen's a little bit more expensive at the moment, but to me, that's because it hasn't had the same level of investment to develop it.
Yep.
But hydrogen in the United States, I believe we're like what, top 2, top 3 in natural gas reserves in the world. We have that edge. So why not take your edge and beat out your competitor and go, I can produce a hydrogen powered vehicle. I can develop it cheaper and I'll sell you the natural gas to go with it and will power your economy. That's what the United States used to do. We have that
Yep.
edge, but we're so convinced that China's electric, we got to be electric. And it's like, no, don't go tit for tat. Do what you do well and beat them. And to me, because hydrogen car is still going to get the same range with that hydrogen, whether it's in Michigan, California, or Florida.
Yep.
That's just kind of. I mean, it may be a little bit less in Michigan because you might have to heat your car a little bit more, but we have that ability. And I just see like all this money just going to EVs, and I'm like, we're not a country the size of Germany to where that can do that. High speed rail, like you were saying, a hydrogen powered high speed rail could take on electric rail with no problem. And it would literally power so many jobs in the United States. Like it would be another industrial revolution. You wouldn't be able to build it fast enough. But yeah, and the reason why I'm bringing this up is you have, like the Chinese relations, right? You've got the experience with the people inside of Washington. Why inside of Washington, especially when it comes, why are they, to me, it seems like they're afraid to compete with China. Like, and it goes back to the US debt affects that a lot as well. People talk about the currency war, right? I say, well, our debt is the biggest reason. Our
Yeah.
debt, like part of why our standard of living has gone down is our debt. I tell people are like, oh, we need to do, we need to prop up this and prop up that. I'm like, we could literally balance the budget better and your standard of living would go up without any aid from the government because
Yeah.
everything would be more affordable. And so just, and from your perspective, right? Why does it seem our government's so afraid to go, hey, we're better at this, whatever it is, versus China? They just seem to be afraid to either say it or afraid to even try to approach it.
Yeah, that's a great point. And by the way, I feel like we have so much ground to cover. Any of your listeners want to learn more, you can always go to rethinkingchina.us. You can subscribe. You have free downloads. You can get a lot of information. So rethinkingchina.us. So love to have anybody who wants to follow up on this conversation. That's a great way. And to answer your question, and again, I've talked to a lot of politicians about this off the record, which is nothing gets people to voting than fear. Fear is actually a great motivator, right? Fear and anger are usually the best motivators to get people to the voting booth to vote for you and against somebody. And with China, it's really good kind of a target in terms of generating fear. But my concern is, as we talked about, usually when you're fearful, you don't make the best decisions long term. And second is, usually you're not thinking about the long term when you're fearful. You're thinking about survival this minute, right? And the things that you're talking about are big vision stuff that can radically change the country's contour, right? And to your point, about 100 years ago, some of the men who made America, by then it was all men, right? Whether it would be the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the JP Morgans, they had big visions. Rockefeller wanted to connect pipelines throughout America. Carnegie wanted to build railroads across America, right? And JP Morgan just wanted to finance everything. So people had big visions back then. And I think, again, as we talked about, we got to go back to the recipes that made us successful. Big personalities with big visions, the ability to allow them to fail and succeed, even in their backyard, right? The ability to attract the world's best talent. Because, like you said, Andrew Carnegie was a kid from Scotland who did not speak or did not really go to school, right? He had very rudimentary schooling, but he was smart, he was driven, and he was willing to do whatever it took to create something amazing. And back then, steel was the technology of that time. Now we think steel is just, a commodity, but back then it was the technology. These were the real inventors. I mean, even people like Thomas Edison, right? Didn't have a huge amount of schooling, right? But these were the tinkerers. These were the inventors. These were the creators, right? I mean, most people don't know Thomas Edison helped create the motion picture business, right? I mean, he was instrumental to electrification, motion picture business, and so many other things, right? Because back then, it wasn't creating the technology, it's creating a whole new industry.
Yes.
And so let's go back to that. Let's go back to what made America successful. And I think that's what we need.
Yeah, and people in America sometimes forget that one of the things that's gotten lost here, and I don't want to say blame social media because it's very easy to say that, but I think part of what it is we're no longer connected on that I won't say normal level, but that real level, and that spreads fear because if your neighbor's a Republican or a Democrat and you're on the opposite side and you know that's what they are, your first thought in this country is going to be they're bad or something about them is not right.
Yeah.
And that's what we've gotten to is where before is, Johnny's a Republican, yeah, whatever. But he's a cool guy, man. We had a beer and barbecue last week. And you know Johnny because Johnny helped you build your basement or build, fix your garage. And that's what, and part of the issue to me, what we don't have now is we don't have the Ronald Reagans. We don't have the I don't want to say Richard Nixon, but Richard Nixon, a lot of people forget, I believe if I'm right, he won almost every state in the nation or all the states. He was insanely popular. A lot of people don't know Richard Nixon created OSHA. What a lot of people here value for safety was created by Tricky Dick, and I don't want to say an underrated president, but I think his paranoia overshadows a lot of his accomplishments. But that's a whole nother story. But we don't have the Eisenhowers, we don't have the FDRs, the JFKs, the guys who really stood up on the podium and said, not to just the average American, but what can you do to make America better to the, to the business world? And I think that is where Donald Trump became popular. So do you know who Michael Moore is?
Yeah, of course.
So
Fahrenheit 9, right?
he's very, very anti-Trump.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
There was a meeting at the Detroit Economic Club. I can't remember when it is. It was 4 or 8 years ago, where it was rumored Ford was going to build a factory, I believe, in either Mexico or Brazil. And Trump was there in front of speaking in front of everybody. So was Michael Moore. And Trump said, if you don't produce those products here, we're going to go after you and we're going to tariff or tax you. So you lose a dime, you lose money on every single thing you bring into this country. And Michael Moore even said right there, he goes, that's why he's president, because he's saying what the American public feels and thinks. And, and they didn't, I don't know if our government did that 100 years ago behind the scenes, right? Because things are a tad bit different. but it was that need to want to invest in your community. And it's how, because China, for all the issues we may have, China is, they got a long road because obviously they have a lot of people. Compared to us, it's a bigger hill to climb. But they're building things. They're building things to help mobilize their country. And do I know what that looks like? No. But you look over there and you just start to see, hey, because I work for a company that has stuff there, right? I don't want to say
Yep,
because
yep,
separate from my company, but
yep,
and one of the big things they say is, well, why we do this is because there's a growing working class.
yep, yep,
So they are doing those things. It is still possible to do it. We're just so, I don't want to say paranoid, but we are paranoid. I mean, we are paranoid about everything that happens around us, and I think that's because to me, we've made ourselves, I'm against being a world police state. I don't agree with what's happening to the Muslims in China.
yep,
But at the same time, I don't know if going to war with China over it is the smartest idea either. To me, to a point, like I use, and I know we're talking about China, but I'm just using this as like an example. Syria, right?
yep,
The Syrians really hated Assad. It turned into this bloody war, but the people there, with the aid of Al Qaeda or not Al Qaeda, but I forget the group's name off the top of my head right now, ISIS.
yep,
They overthrew the government. They built a new system for themselves. They did it. They were willing to lose everything they had. And to me, until a population is willing to give everything they have, you will never see real change. And the young generation now, I tell this to people that work because I work with a lot of people from 18 to 30.
yep.
You guys have never really been through post-dot-com bubble. You were born and around in 2008, but
Yep.
you weren't economically around then. You're about to get a dose of reality of what happens when the government just hands you money and tells you everything's going to be fine, and they don't actually do anything to fix the problem.
Yeah. Look, I'm a huge believer in the American experiment, right? And the truth is, I think people who became naturalized citizens many times feel this more personally because they had to make the conscious decision to come here and make the conscious decision to become a citizen because they really believe in this place, right? So I'm a huge believer in the American experiment. I also believe that just as we expect our country to protect and serve us, we must do our part to protect our country and serve our country. And one thing that Americans do well throughout our history is to speak up when we think our government isn't doing right by us, right? To speak truth to power, right? This is also one reason I'm writing this book because I feel like this is something we have to talk about, which is we need to make sure that we don't sleepwalk into a war with China. Now, granted, there might be cases we need to get into a war with China. We need to be prepared militarily. However, given the consequences, we need to be really thoughtful so that we make sure our assumptions are all correct, right? That we're willing to do it because it's in our interest. So, like you said, is our interest, do we agree with how the Chinese treat the Uyghurs? We probably don't. But are we willing to get into war? I would say the majority of Americans would say no. We don't want to get into a nuclear war with China over how a certain part of their population is being treated. So today, we're dangerously close to a war over Taiwan. And yet, almost nobody asks, so why do we want to fight over Taiwan? Like, this is a question I've asked all these so called experts, and nobody can answer me, right? At first, people would say, well, we want to fight the Chinese on Taiwan because of democracy. Taiwan is a democracy. And I said, well, there are a lot of democracies in the world, right? So are we committed to fighting every democracy? So they stop, right? The next thing I hear is, well, we want to fight the Chinese on Taiwan because of the chips, right? Because Taiwan controls all the chips. And I said, well, I worked in Intel. I worked in these fabs. I know that if you really don't want the Chinese to control the chips, you just bomb those places because these are big factories. You just bomb them, drop a bomb, and they're done. Or all these factories use American equipment and American software. You stop licensing to them, they're not going to be able to run in a few days, if not a few weeks, right? So I said that can't be the case, right? So today, I have not heard a good reason why we want to go to war with China. And that's something I think is very important that every American should be asking this question because, again, I'm not saying we shouldn't go to war with China because there may be a reason, but we got to know what the reason is.
Yes.
We can't sleepwalk into another war like we did in Iraq, in Afghanistan, or in Vietnam, right? Because assumptions matter. For example, in Vietnam, the assumption was if South Vietnam fell, all of rest of Asia will fall like dominoes, right? The domino effect. Thailand would fall, Indonesia would fall, Philippines would fall, Malaysia would fall. And you know what? South Vietnam fell and nobody else fell, right? So that assumption was just patently wrong. And yet it consumed a generation of Americans, right? It destroyed LBJ's Great Society programs, right? It completely divided the country because we went into a war under false assumptions. So I want to make sure that if we do get into a war, and I want to be a little bit more explicit because I went to talk to all these folks who've done credible war games. There's a lot of, again, classified war games that you can't share, but there's a few that have been done by credible organizations like a CSIS. And I have to tell you, Joe, most people don't understand. Taiwan is 20 million people. It's smaller than the size of the city of Shanghai. The GDP of Taiwan is smaller than the GDP of Shanghai, right? 20 million people versus 1.4 billion people. There is zero chance Taiwan could defend itself without the active participation of American troops. Meaning, on Taiwan, this is not a Ukraine. We cannot just provide military equipment, intelligence, and Taiwan will fight on its own. No, the only way Taiwan can defend itself is America fighting directly against the Chinese. And so I look at these war games, I talk to these authors. Now, these authors obviously are pro American, so they assume America will win. But even when America wins the first battle, we lose 2 aircraft destroyers. We lose more personnel than about 50% of all the people we lose in 10 years of fighting in Iraq. We lose hundreds of aircraft and then maybe a few dozen, ship vessels, right? And that's just the first battle. And then I asked them, okay, let's say the Chinese lose this first battle, but they're not going to quit. What happens after the first battle?
Right.
And nobody can answer that question because the Chinese shipyards on the east coast of China, are we going to bomb it? Because they're right next to the civilian population. Their military bases are next to civilian populations. Are we bombing it? And if we bomb their mainland, are they going to bomb our territories? Are they going to bomb our mainland? And once you escalate like that, is nuclear weapons on the table? This is something that almost all experts just stop answering my questions because the consequences are so severe and the scenarios are so dire, nobody wants to talk about it. But I think we should have a frank conversation because if we're willing to get into war, we got to know one, what we're fighting for and what we're willing to sacrifice. And without knowing that, we're going to do exactly what we did in the last few wars, which is sleepwalking into a war that has false premises. And after many American lives and treasures are lost, we're left scratching our head going, why? Why did we just do that? What happened? That money could have been spent in America, helping American people, right? So that's kind of another urgency for me to do this is because I want to make sure we have this conversation before it's too late.
Yeah, no, that was I don't know if you paid or if you knew I'm sure you know who Kevin O'Leary is.
Yeah.
And this is like a far out there thing, but I was to a degree with him when he said when Trump was, "Oh, we're going to do these tariffs." He said, "Why are you doing these nickel and dime things?" He goes, "If you want to come to a resolution, that 400% tariff on it starting today." He goes, "And Xi will be here next week." He goes, "Because Xi, just like Trump, to stay in power, he's got to keep making them money. And if the United States, it would hurt both countries significantly, but if you did that, it would force China to the table to finally address these issues that both sides seem to be having, and we wouldn't be nobody would be able to him haw about it anymore, and
Yeah.
it would just come to a head." And I was like, I know that makes a lot of people nervous, but I'm like, to me, it's like with where everything's at, and you would know from more behind the scenes, right? When he said that, I was like, sometimes things do got to come to a head for some kind of solution to come out.
Yeah. Now, Joe, I do want to add a little nuance to that, right? Because for a very long time, again, I'll use the example of the previous wars we've engaged in, and also the last 10 years of kind of our now competition and confrontation against China. Is we believe that if we just escalate a little bit more, that the other side will come to the table. Like the perfect example is as I look to Vietnam, our idea is if we bomb them just a little bit more, they're kind of gotta give up. If we bomb the Ho Chi Minh Trail, they're gonna give up. If we start bombing, and put Nabon over all these tropic, sites, they're gonna give up. Yes, there might be a chance, but in many other instances, the other side decides that if they escalate just along with us, that we might give up. That's what the Vietnamese did in the Vietnam War. That's what the Taliban's did in Afghanistan. In the last 10 years, we've seen that's what the Chinese have done. So, for example, when Trump said, you know what, I'm slapping 135% tariff on China, which, by the way, pretty much meant, trade would stop because everything is twice as more expensive. The Chinese actually said, in that case, we're slapping 100% tariff. So they were willing to escalate with us. So I just want to put a little bit nuance to the table to that. It does work in certain instances, but we have to also look at the results of how, quote unquote, our opponent or adversary are responding to us. And if history shows that they will also have the same mindset of, okay, if the Americans are escalating and try to cause us pain, we're going to escalate just as quickly to cause them pain. We got to be careful to not to get into that bind because you know what happened, in those other instances when we got into that bind. So that's the only nuance I want to put into it.
Yeah, I think, from where he was coming, just based off of obviously his speeches
Yeah,
on TV, it
yeah,
was more of the shock factor.
yeah, yeah,
You
yeah,
throw a 400% tariff, he's going to have all the leaders that make money over there going, fix this problem and fix it now.
yeah,
Because, and when you're doing it gradually, you don't have
yeah,
that shock factor. You
yeah,
say, you come out, say 400%, even if you don't slap it on right away,
yeah, yeah,
it's going to put out that, okay, well, these guys are actually serious. They
yeah,
actually want to solve a problem. And I
yeah,
don't know if that's the solution, right? Because,
yeah,
it could cause brinksmanship.
yeah,
It could,
yeah,
but
yeah,
if you really want to solve a problem and you're feeling like your opponent isn't doing things in good faith, which I don't think either
yeah,
side particularly has, you got to either be willing to cut the mustard or pack your bags and go home.
yeah,
Like you got to be willing to either do business and figure out a way to make it work, or you got to be willing to take them to the task. And it just seems like we want to be like, and China doesn't
yeah,
play that way. China's
yeah.
you're either beating us or you're not.
Yeah. And to your point, Joe, for me, as I think about what you just said, and as I think about my business dealings, I think sometimes you have to make those tough decisions, but you have to be ready for the consequences of the other side coming back to you, either giving up or escalating with you. Right. So this is why I say again, we really need to think through what we decide to do. So for example, like you said, hey, if we're willing to slap that 400%, then we also got to be willing to say, you know what, they might slap 300% and we're going to be okay with it. Right. So as long as we're okay with it, then that's a real option in our arsenal. The only thing I would have a little quibble with is we do things without realizing that, you know what, we may not be okay with it. As long as we're okay with it, then I would say, hey, that's a real option. And we
Right.
should give it a try in the cases where it needs to be tried.
Right. No, and there's a lot and like more of a positive tone, right? Is there is a lot of relations between the two countries that could produce a lot more fruitful situations for everybody involved. Like you take the governments out of it, the average people in China and the average Americans, they don't want to deal with none of this. They just want to go to work, feed their families, come home, hang out with their kids or their dogs, and go on about their day. That's what they want. I don't want to say America's become afraid because I don't. That is not where I'm going to. But it just seems like our politicians are froze.
Yeah.
And you might know that, and that's not saying that they don't care. But I feel like, maybe you could elaborate. It feels like from the common man's perspective, either A, they really have no clue of what's going on, or B, they're scared.
Yeah. And by the way, this is why I find, your platform so useful because look, just a couple of decades ago, all of us were just fed a couple of channels of information. And
Mm,
that was it. Right.
yep,
And many of them are largely the same. And I think now people can actually get information in a more holistic way. Right. There are
yes.
many more channels, right? And that's really important because I feel like, as I look at the news coverage, media coverage on China in particular, I find that the media is not necessarily lying to us, but many times they're only giving us half the information.
Constant.
And I can make a decision I think is the right decision with half of the information, but usually that's the wrong decision because I only have half of the information, right? And so I'm very happy to that today. People could go outside of those few channels to get a fuller set of information. And that's really important because in the end, I really trust the American people, right? I think presented with the facts, the American people will ultimately make good decisions. And this kind of goes back to the foundation of the democracy, which is the idea that it's for the people, by the people, and of the people. You got to trust the people in the first place, right? And so having these kind of conversations with people saying, you know what, hey, China is a threat. From the beginning, I said China is a threat, but we need to assess what kind of threat is China, because we can then respond accordingly and proportionately. Second is, let's assess our rhetoric vis-a-vis the results, because in the end, good intention does not equal good results.
No,
And
no.
we need to make sure that the results correspond with the rhetoric, because if the results don't correspond, we better change our assumptions, right? And then lastly, I think most important, and you kind of touched on this, is let's focus on what has worked for America. There's a recipe that works great for America, got us where we are. Look, I do want to put everything in context because I'm a numbers guy. China today, even though it's 5 times the population as the US, it's only 70% of the US's GDP, only 70%. And most economists think it'll take until 2050 or even later for China to surpass the US in GDP, right? So yes, they're a threat, but they're not as big of a threat. And by the way, per capita GDP, meaning how much per person produces, Americans kick their butt. We're 5 to 7 times more productive per capita. So we got to realize we got a lot of strength.
Yeah.
Right. We got a great platform. We got a winning recipe. We got to double down what makes us successful. To your point of trying to copy China, trying to, mimic what they do, in certain cases, we should learn from them. But I think in almost all cases, we got to remember what made us successful.
Yeah, and again, and this is a hill I'll probably die on, and I know, a lot of people. I truly, honestly believe the more research I do down to my core that hydrogen would be the next oil boom in America, and I don't even think the average American quite understands how much of an edge we have with natural gas. Like I don't because we're so focused on just basic petroleum.
Yeah.
That's all they hear about, and we like natural gas. If we really focused on that, I mean, there would be very few places in the world that could even touch us.
And by the way, this is what I love about America is you have people who just believe in something so passionately that despite what everybody around them say to the contrary, they keep on doing it. And then they create something magical, right? I mean, look, Steve Jobs, right? He believed that, hey, look, you can put everything in the palm of this little device, right? And nobody believed it. And he made it happen. And now everybody has one, right? I mean, the number of entrepreneurs who've been so passionate that they've completely changed a generations people's perspective. I mean, that's kind of what defined America and still defines America, right? So again, I really like that, right? No, look, I can't read the future.
I
I don't
wish
know
I
if
could.
right. I don't know if that's gonna be true or not. Again, there's always interesting competing technologies that come on,
Oh yeah.
every time. So I can't and I don't know enough about hydrogen, but I think it's people making those giant bets that can change the entire country and potentially the entire world. That's what made America great.
Yeah, Mercedes and BMW, and I think Ford is in on it. Well, Ford building a couple of hydrogen fueling stations here. I know in Germany and Australia, Mercedes is testing out semis and heavy equipment powered by hydrogen engines. And I'm just sitting here going, I'm like, okay, like let's take a step back and think about how America operates. Even the average American who don't need it, we operate in a heavy equipment mindset. So if
Yeah.
I want to sell a car,
Yeah.
that's the easiest way to do it. Go, hey man, don't worry about that electric thing. I got something that's better. And
Yeah.
and I don't know, like our business leaders are afraid to say it. They're afraid to do it. I don't know, but with China, it is a competitor, like you said. It is our competition. It is our version of the Soviet Union now, like this generation's. But what I think that is a very underpinned, underlooked at, and because when you look at the younger crowd in America, everybody thinks pierced nose, hair, screaming, crying about everything. But when you really look at Gen Z, it's not what the media tells you. And it was very surprising to me and what got me started down that road is Yale did a study, and young people from the ages of 18 to 21, that Gen Z part, are 12 points more conservative than other generations in that when we're in that spot. And I was like, that is just it's astonishing to me because America's history has always been younger people tend to be liberal. As you get older, you tend to lean more conservative. But this is a complete flip of how things have happened. And they have a more conservative view of the world, right? So they take a lot of pride in America, even if they don't agree. They take a lot of pride. And I think it's very undersold. What you see on TV is unhappiness with what's going on,
Yeah.
not with our country. And now, because the TV, I don't know if you ever seen those things like during the the elections where they're like, oh, there's this huge crowd. And then they zoom out and it's like 200 people, and you're sitting there and you're going, oh man, if that wasn't a PR move, if there was any, but Gen Z and then Gen Z, I believe now from compared to millennials and Gen X are going to church at a 2.5 times higher rate. The last generation that went to church at this rate was what they call the greatest generation.
Yeah.
So, and that's, that's a real fundamental shift towards America from 60, 70 years ago. It's not the same way of living, but it's people looking back and going, our country is happier. We are happier as a people when we did certain things. It looks different to them, and that's where, like, I think that in the long run will benefit. And I think that that'll benefit American Chinese relations because they're more willing to go, how can we fix this problem? Than they are engaging in the rhetoric. It did an episode, what was it? Gen Z, the political shift. My God, that thing went like crazy. I mean, I think right now it sits at like $50,000 just on that episode by itself. The young people, man, they just really started eating it up. And I started getting massive amounts of messages. Man, nobody ever really wants to give us a chance. Me personally, I think our future is bright. But it really, I think in America, I say it now to my son, I'm like, I don't feel like it in my head, but now I'm starting to become the old crowd. Yeah, your day's gone. Like, you're getting out to where the young people look at you and go, yeah, okay. And we're headed there. And that's what gives me hope for tomorrow and things like we can compete with China because these kids want to see a better community. They want to see stronger and they are willing to take a corporation to task and they're willing to go all out. If you're not going to invest in me, I'm not going to shop with you. And I think you are seeing some corporate companies going, oh man, these people really are mad. Our PR stunts aren't working anymore. Because some of them did do PR stunts, right? Like, oh, look, we're going to, like Amazon, when they're like, oh, Amazon's going to raise wages to $18 an hour. But what they didn't tell everybody was we're going to cut everybody's hours. Yeah. So yeah, Amazon did raise everybody's wages, but they cut the hours. So really all just balanced out and nothing changed. And now like the younger people are starting to go, they're calling it out. They're going, hey, that's not what it is to where like my generation, old generations, we had a habit of taking some companies at their word, going, we're going to raise wages. Okay. And, it's kind of like during COVID, right? Oh, we're going to raise wages. We're going to give out this free money. Well, that's great. But what are you going to do are you going to produce more products that are going to come from that? Because if you don't, all you're going to do is shrink the supply and drive prices up.
Yeah.
And that's the one thing that they weren't telling people. This Gen Z is now going, man, we got hook, line, and sinker. And we were lied to, by both parties, really, and that's how they're feeling, right? And that's why I said I still think Washington is so disconnected from us, that they don't hear that part. They don't hear, like they talk about, I had an episode where we go, oh, hey, we want subsidies in America, to compete with either the Chinese or the healthcare. And I'm like, why don't we stop and look at what the real problem is? Why does it cost so freaking much for something so basic? Like, that's the real problem, and nobody wants to talk about that. They just want to take more money from us and give it to them. So when Obamacare, I did an episode with a guy, his name's Larry from Fresh Mouth Club. The reason I bring him up is he was in the insurance industry. He ran an insurance brokerage agency. Obamacare pushed him out. And the one thing he said to me, he goes, well, what they didn't tell people was all Obamacare did was just shift the problem from what you see to what you don't see. And then they raised your taxes to pay for it. And he said they didn't really fix any problems and they pushed competitive plans out the window. So it made your healthcare go even up because in America, and I know this isn't the case in places like China where if the government says, hey, we're doing this, people don't just jack the prices up. Well, here in America, when you go, the government's going to step in and we're going to guarantee it. It's like when you say that in America, the dollar signs just start hitting people's eyeballs and all of a sudden the prices skyrocket and inflation goes crazy. It's not that way everywhere. I get that, but it is here. Oh, and it's a very disappointing thing to me to see that, like education, right? You look at your numbers, guys. As soon as loans were guaranteed by the government, boom, universities started raising their rates at record paces for 30 years straight, and that's like, okay, well, here in Michigan, our governor said, if you raise it more than 2% a year, you're not going to get state funding. Well, they were like, that's fine. So they said, we're not going to get state funding and just raised it 10%. And that's where I'm like, well, okay, if the federal government said the same thing, I think you'd see a shift in how universities operate because it really shouldn't cost this much. We talk about like, there's an education gap, right? big in America. How can we, because Chinese, I mean, the average Chinese child is way smarter coming out of school than America. But that's a different in culture more than it is the system to me. And that's just like we don't put people in a good position. Germany, we talked a couple little bit about Germany. Well, in Germany, they put free education is based on what's in demand. Engineers, doctors, things like that. Free ride. If you want to be, I don't know, default general studies, whatever, it's still pretty much free, but you're going to have to pay for some of it because it's not really what the country needs. And to me, I'm going, man, like healthcare wouldn't be so expensive in America if you could just shift that $500,000 that a doctor pays to go to college to a loan or whatever, or free from the federal government. People go, well, you're still shifting it. Well, but that $500,000 over the term of what that doctor provides is actually going to be a savings, because you're going, okay, now that doctor doesn't have to come in and charge you $300 just to look at your eyeball. Now that doctor can turn a profit charging you $100. He's still going to make a killing, and that's what we used to do. And we don't do that here where when you look at countries like China, right? China is willing to go, okay, we're going to step in and subsidize this because we know we need to be competitive at it. We need to do this. America, we're focused on arguing about, well, we're going to keep the government shut down because everybody doesn't want to give us what we want. And it's just like, I'm like, man, we're making fools of ourselves on on the world stage because we can't agree to pay the electric bill, and it's so baffling. And here in Michigan, and I use it because I will say that I've always been critical of both parties, but I was really proud of the state. Michigan, between Democrats and Republicans, they got Republicans to agree record investment in K through 12 education in the state of Michigan. Republicans signed on to that. And that was really telling to me. And the Republicans said, yeah, we want to make sure all kids in Michigan get free breakfast and lunch. And I'm like, if we can do that here, why can't we do that on a national level? Like, if we did things like that, we could compete. It doesn't got to be, like I got it is so frustrating for me in that part. And once I started seeing that, I started going, man, we need more state control because when Michigan was left to its own devices per se, we had the biggest manufacturing economy in the world. In the world when Michigan was able to do its job, the governors have to go hat in hand to the president and go, please, sir, will you help me? And we're not a monarchy, but we treat the presidency like it's a king, like the president is the end all be all. And that's not the way our government's supposed to. President's supposed to be the big leader, supposed to be, things of that nature, right? But it doesn't need to be, what it is. And I'm sorry, that's just like a soapbox that I go on because
Yes.
I really feel like those are the things that really they're a barrier to us from competing with the Chinese.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, Joe, you hit the nail around the head, right? Which is for us to compete against the Chinese or anybody, we've got to first fix our own house.
Yes.
Right. And you list a number of things that probably not just you, but many other Americans have talked about of, hey, I see a problem in my community, in my state, even on a national level, and we need to fix it. And if we fix it, we become more competitive. Simple as that. Right.
Yes.
And that's in my mind, that's like so common sense that let's fix our own, workings, and then we'll be an amazing position to compete against anybody and everybody. So that one, I 100% in agreement with you. And I'm also in agreement in the sense that one thing that makes the American experiment very interesting is we are the United States, meaning these are states that agreed to unite together. So every state does have some ability to innovate on its own. And politics isn't static either. Politics has been innovating over the last 250 years too, right? I mean, we started with only landed people, landed people could vote, to then everybody could vote, then to women, et cetera, right? We've been innovating too. So I think this is an age of great innovation
Yes, it
on
is.
the political level, on the social level, on the economic level. And I think the best people to innovate are the American people. I actually don't think the best people to innovate are, quote unquote political leaders from DC. That's kind of how I think about it. Of course, to your point, having a great leader coalesces people, bring people together, and push things forwards. I'm always, on the lookout for amazing leaders that can bring people together and push people forward because that's necessary. It's human nature. We need people to kind of help kind of shepherd everybody. But innovation doesn't have to come from one leader. Innovation can come from the bottom.
Yeah, and as we wrap up here, the one person I'll say, and I know a lot of people are vehemently against this guy, but I really love the way he talks. Vivek Ramaswamy. When that I really what really drew me to him is he did a there was a like a 5 minute clip on YouTube, and he was with Charlie Kirk, and they were talking at one of those turning point events, and it was a conservative gay Republican woman, and she was like, "Well, what I'm told is, me and my wife, this that, we wouldn't be allowed. That's what people say to me." And he goes, "Listen, I'll tell you what the real deal is here." He goes, "Republicans don't care what you do when you're an adult. When you're an adult, live your life, do what you want. Just don't expect us to pay for it. But we'll protect your rights." He said, "Don't bring it into the schools, but we will protect your right to exist." And I'm like, and then he said, "We want you to be included." And I was like, as soon as he said that, I'm going, if I was a GOP strategist, I'd have been picking up the phone going, "Hey man, I need you to get ready to run for president or something here." He's got a lot that's a downside. I get it, but he cares so much about America. He's a first generation Indian,
Yep.
but
Yep.
he in his heart, when you listen to him speak, it's in.
No, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it very much. Rethinking China, challenging our economic assumptions and opportunities for lasting prosperity coming out in February next year. Please, if you're interested and any of your readers, thank you. I appreciate it, Joe. Real pleasure. And, again, congratulations to you for making this a great platform in just such a short span of time. That also took huge amount of commitment and dedication. Let's be honest. You don't do this by just posting one. Like you said, you post what, 144 episodes, right? Exactly. So that's exactly the spirit, American spirit we've been talking about. Congratulations. Yeah. Oh, yeah. 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 Thank you. Appreciate it. Appreciate it, Joe. Appreciate it, Joe. Yeah. Happy holidays. Happy Thanksgiving.